Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is John Reed, who's the author of a new book called Elegant Simplicity, Reflections on an Alternative Way of Being. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bruce.
Good to have you with us today. Tell us a bit about yourself. I know you lived part of the time in Europe. Tell us your story a bit.
I'm an Englishman, born in Brazil, a Brazilian mother, and spent most of my life in Europe, but went to college in Montreal. That was my first introduction to North America. Since then, I've been going backwards and forwards. I have a French wife who I met in the States. And, but the origin of this book was in my early 20s when I became fascinated by trying to discover the meaning and purpose of life. And since then, I've looked in it from different sources. I've traveled widely. And this is the culmination, if you want, of my researches.
So why did you particularly set out to write this particular book?
Well, to be honest, I thought that the events of 2008, the collapse of the financial system in particular, for me, it marked a critical threshold in the egoistic consciousness that prevails in the world. And I think that we were, and I believe so even more so now, that we are creating the conditions for a perfect storm that in the long run could threaten our survival on the planet. From the inside, from our internal contradictions, and from the outside, from results of climate change and global warming and so on. We're seeing plenty of evidence of this at present.
So this book is available at local bookstores, for example, the Gulf of Maine and in Brunswick?
Yes, in many other, in Falmouth, Camden, Damariscotta, and different local bookstores.
Okay. Well, I strongly encourage people to pick it up because I read it and it's a fascinating read. I want to start by just reading two lines from early in the book. You say, "Only a profound modification in our conception and purpose of life can see us through this enduring crisis successfully." And you go on to say, "Centuries of materialism at the expense of the spirit are now causing it," meaning capitalism, "to unravel from the weight of its contradictions." I'd like you to turn to the book and read us a section that I found particularly moving. We're going to ask John to read a couple different places throughout this interview. Would you start out with that page 17, John?
Sure. We don't know where to find meaning. Soul is and will always be the expression of our spiritual nature. It's what enables us to sense our way to the essential meaning of things. Without it, we are unregulated by the spirit and become destructive to ourselves and to the planet we live in. What we see happening around us today is a result of this disconnection. Jung, one of the fathers of modern psychiatry, made this important observation. When you study the mental history of the world, you see that people in times immemorial had a general teaching or doctrine about the wholeness of the world. In our civilization, this spiritual background has gone astray. Our Christian doctrine has lost its grip to an appalling extent, largely because people don't understand it anymore. Thus, one of the most important instinctual activities of mind has lost its object. As these views deal with the world as a whole, they create also a wholeness of the individual. Among all my patients in the second half of life, every one of them fell ill because he had lost what the living religions of the past had given their followers, and none of them has really been healed who did not regain his spiritual outlook.
Say a bit more about this particular section.
Well, in broad terms, the spiritual teachings have always told us, and this is from all the traditions, that that we inhabit a spiritual reality. We haven't really understood that, and we haven't incorporated that understanding into the way we live. The result has been man's egoism. We concentrate on ourselves and we separate ourselves by an illusory feeling that we are the only
thing that matters.
Players in this. the problem is that doesn't serve us well. It creates violence and destruction in the world. It creates personal unhappiness. And this is the first thing that one has to understand, that egoism is not a solution for man's contentment, happiness, or for the good of the world.
You say about ego, the failure to rise above our egoistic ways has fashioned a civilization far less glorious than we would like to believe, and one that will slowly destroy itself. So talk more about the ego's role, and how can we become free of this ego that dominates us the way it does, both individually and sort of nationally in a hyper empire the way we are today?
Well, because, if we don't accept that we're part of a spiritual reality, all we see is our short-term self-interest. All we see is what we can gain for ourselves, individually, collectively, and this is what we've done. Now, we can claim that our civilization is great because we have great works of art and literature and so on, but where has it taken us today? It has taken us to widespread violence, injustice, inequality, disease, mental and physical. So it's not working, and it's not working because we haven't understood who we are intrinsically. We haven't understood the context in which we live, and this is fundamental to our survival.
Now, as a person that lives in Europe at least half of your life, how do you perceive from a distance the United States, the ego of the United States in the world today? And here you come half the year to the United States, so it must be an interesting dynamic for you.
Well, the United States is an absolutely fascinating society because it's the laboratory of the world. I mean, this is where everything is experimented to its greatest degree. It's freed from the traditions of Europe. They're largely Europeans who've emancipated themselves from the past, and they come here to experience a context of activity, freedom, accomplishment, and so in a sense this is always going to be the cutting edge. Unfortunately, it will exemplify the worst as well as the best, and it's also where man's egoism, in a sense, is most clearly delineated, because this is where if a government wants to control a situation, it has the means to do it. If an individual wants to develop an idea, he can do so and become very powerful and wealthy in the process. And so, the United States is critical in understanding all these issues we're talking about. And this is something that's always fascinated me about this country. It's the energy, the achievement, in a good sense and in a less good sense.
You say that very few people recognize the degree to which the need to be liked, to be loved or respected rules their lives, depriving them of psychological independence. What is psychological independence, and what happens when we don't have it?
Well, if we don't understand our spiritual roots, we are rootless. And we don't have a real identity. So we get our identity from the things that we associate with, identify with, and so on. But this doesn't give you real inner security, and you become prey to fashions, trends, images. The false aspects of reality can have a meaning for you, and lack of psychological independence is a feeding ground of any form of fascism. So,
Say more about that. What do you mean by that? In what way does that manifest itself?
Because the only true identity we have is our spiritual identity, and this is the same for all men all over the world. If you don't have that by default, you associate yourself with, all that you can see are the trends, are the forces that surround you. If they're powerful enough, they create a mass movement. We've seen them in the past. I don't have to elaborate on that. And they're extremely dangerous to the stability of the world.
When you look at the U.S. today, both from a distance and then as you're here today in Maine, do you see any signs of that developing, that greatest fear of all, of heading towards that state of fascism? Do you see any signs of that in the United States?
Again, the United States demonstrates the best and the worst. We saw the worst during a certain period in the Bush regime, where the United States took upon itself to invade countries. And I'm not saying that there aren't certain justifications at certain times for doing that. There may well be. Hitler had to be countered. But the point is that the United States has such overwhelming power at this point that unless it has the appropriate wisdom to know how to use that power, it will misuse it. And I think this has been the case.
You're very polite.
I'm your guest.
All right, that's okay. Would you go to page 28 in your book and read to us that section there that I found very interesting?
In one sense, higher education is clearly a misnomer. Advanced levels of education, by accumulating greater knowledge in ever more specialized fields, tend to increase rather than diminish the fragmented way in which we view the world. We are then left highly prepared and informed to do little more than advance our self-interest in a manner that more and more people experience as humanly unfulfilling. The frantic pursuit of distractions and amusements of every variety can never obscure this fact from us entirely. Try as we might, we can't escape the fact that only by evaluating and relating learning in terms of the meaning and purpose of life can knowledge be of any psychological value to us.
What are you really saying in that section?
I'm saying that in relation to knowledge, there's two. There's the vertical continuum and there's the horizontal continuum. We accumulate any amount of knowledge along the horizontal continuum. It doesn't become qualitative unless it's on the vertical, unless we can relate it to the whole. That makes sense. That gives it meaning. But so the endless accumulation of extremely specialized knowledge isn't really useful, except in a very limited sense. But it doesn't contribute to the wholeness of a human being. It doesn't contribute to his wisdom, his understanding of the whole. That is on the vertical continuum. That's the point I'm making.
You mentioned the words from the Bible, love of money is the root of all evil. Mm-hmm. And then you say that people enthusiastically agree with that, but then spend their entire lives trying to make as much of it as possible. You call this a society dedicated to superficiality, a spiritual impoverishment. Now, those are strong words. What do you mean by this spiritual impoverishment and a society dedicated to superficiality?
Well, it's not dedicated. Superficiality is the consequence. Basically, if we don't believe in a spiritual reality, we believe by default in a material one, and we dedicate all our activities to that material reality in an egoistic way. There's no other way that we can relate to the material world without a spiritual understanding. ego exists by default. And the comment about the money is the root of all evil is everybody agrees because we're morally conditioned to believe that money is a bad thing. But it comes from the Bible. So we still dedicate our lives to accumulating as much as we can because we're essentially faithless. We don't understand. We don't allow ourselves to be inhabited by the spiritual reality. And so we are, by definition, faithless, and you cannot act any other way, because that's where you place your trust, in mammon, and that's how we behave.
Can you give a few examples of how this spiritual impoverishment plays out in the real world?
I think in the desolation that one sees in the state of the world, the injustice, the inequality, the violence, the delinquency, the levels of depression. I mean, there's 700,000 attempted suicides a year in the United States, the richest country with the highest standards of living. All of that is meaningless if you don't have an understanding of your spiritual roots. And so we see it all the time. People eat themselves into states of obesity. This is all symptoms of inner disarray.
You maintain in the book that the only possible explanation for our collective bad political choices in choosing our leadership is because we're not awake. What do you mean by this, not awake?
Back to the same thing, as we're not rooted in our intrinsic spiritual nature, we are unconscious. We are subject to the stream of thoughts and identifications which are going through our minds. That is our consciousness, and this creates confusion,
and easily being manipulated, I would imagine.
Very easily, and the problem is that manipulation is seen on a broad scale in the way the electorate works. I mean, we elect politicians of very little moral value, often of some intellectual value, but very little moral value. So the moral nature of their politics is lacking. This wasn't always the case, but it's certainly the case now to a greater and greater degree.
It's interesting because as you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the growth of the Christian fundamentalist movement, who say to introduce morals back into politics, but often, in my opinion, many and most of the politicians that the Christian fundamentalists support are some of the most immoral people that I see around. Do you agree that there's a real contradiction there?
Yes, I do, because it's not really that the evangelical movement is not really what I'm referring to when I talk about spirituality. Mm-hmm. And so nor is there.
So you're saying that evangelical movement's off track?
Yes, in terms of spiritual values, in the deepest sense.
In what way? Give me one or two examples.
Because it's still rooted in conventional religious, practice. The mystical interpretation of spirituality is understanding who we are. There's nothing. It's a very simple concept. It's a question of understanding who we are and how we operate, the mechanics of being. This is really what all the spiritual teachings have ever been, and they're trying to tell you how to go towards being what you are. We are made in the image of God, as it said in the Bible, meaning that we have all the potential to be godlike. Now we're a far cry from that, clearly, because of our identification with the ego, which separates us from that. But this is what it is. It's so evangelical movements that are concentrated in one particular religion, and often in a slightly distorted or fanatical sense, is quite misleading.
You ask in the book, and again, I'm talking to John Reed, author of Elegant Simplicity, Reflections on an Alternative Way of Being. You ask, hasn't our technology exceeded our humanity? And then you write about consumerism and suffering. Are you saying that technology and consumerism have destroyed our ability to feel the world in a human kind of way? Does this make it easier, for example, for us to kill people around the world to take their oil so that we can drive our cars?
Well, I think it does have a relationship to that. I mean, that quote was one of Einstein's quote, and it was probably as a result of the use of the atomic bomb after the war. And but it's just as applicable today as it was then. Its most obvious example would be in the weapons of mass destruction that we've created, but it also can be seen in a more trivial sense by the gadgets that we invent that create a whole culture of communication. With, the use of gadgets and text messaging and all that sort of thing. It doesn't improve the quality of life. They come on a stream into the consumer society, and people use these things, but it doesn't contribute to the quality of life in any way at all. Mass communication.
When I read this part of the book, all I could think about was Black Elk Speaks, the book by the native Lakota out in South Dakota, talking about the American Indian spirituality and their connection to the land and their connection to the spirit in that place and time, and in the simplicity of life. And Native people have always said that the white man's culture came in with all this technology, and it really, like a stick, was the spiritual connection was broken, was snapped.
Yeah.
In a way, it seems that you're saying the same thing as Black Elk was saying in that book written long ago.
Absolutely. The Indian cultures had a great sense of the sacred, a natural spirituality. They saw life in whole terms. They were not cut off, disconnected from nature like we are. And we have an enormous amount to learn from them. And it's a symptom of our ignorance and to have not really absorbed their wisdom.
So then, John, how do we move to a collective higher state of consciousness when we are surrounded by such artificiality in our world?
I think on an individual basis, it cannot be from the top down. This will never happen politically. It has to happen one individual at a time, and people have to become more aware of themselves. It's by self-observation. You are your own laboratory. You see how how selfishness and self-interest does not pay dividends. You may think it does in the short term. It doesn't in the long term. Getting what you want is not the source of happiness. Once you realize these things, you start looking at it. You keenly observe yourself and become much more self-critical. And this will be the first portal to some form of a higher consciousness.
You say if our grandchildren are to survive on this planet, we must experiment not with a new way of thinking, but with a new way of being. Talk more about this.
Well, clearly we can't project hundreds of years into the future the way we are at the moment. We're depleting the resources of the planet. There is extraordinary injustice and inequality in the world. None of this is sustainable. And all of this is because of our individual and collective egoism. If we need a new orientation to life, that can only come from a spiritual understanding of it. If we do, there is a lot of hope for the future, and our grandchildren will benefit.
Let's go to the last reading that you'll do, page 101 in your book, Elegant Simplicity, Reflections on an Alternative Way of Being, available at the Gulf of Maine bookstore in Brunswick, by the way. John, would you read that section, please?
Where once men possessed a profound communion with nature, the ego in the form of our ruthless predecessors, believing themselves to be civilizers, managed to destroy all connection with the sacred source of life. In The Course of Empire by Bernard Devoto, he wrote, "The first belt knife given by a European to an Indian was a portent as great as the cloud that mushroomed over Hiroshima. In an instant, the man of 6000 BC was bound fast to a way of life that had developed 7.5 millennia beyond his own. He began to live better, and he began to die." That's a stunning statement, actually. And that's exactly what happened. You know, we gave him the tools to improve his physical, material existence, but we cut him off from his soul. He began to live better, and he began to die. And this is what we've done to ourselves. It's time to reverse that.
John, you end the book with the words, "Hope can never be abandoned." Where do you find your hope?
There is a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope because I believe we're in a critical state of transition from one state of consciousness to another. And there are examples of men and women who have adopted saner, simpler, and more spiritual way of life. And at all levels, I came across a book by two French journalists who went around the world in all the continents interviewing people who demonstrate and who are changing the ways of the world, who demonstrate this new paradigm, which is to say, of service to humanity, and at the same time working within the economic context that we understand. And they're doing remarkable things. Then very little known, very little is known of them. The media doesn't give coverage to those things at present. But they're there, and in growing quantities. Communities within the United States are moving to different ways of living and being, and commercial endeavors are also being run on different. So there's a lot of hope in there, but we have to understand that this has not reached a critical mass yet.
And so we each have a role in pushing this forward.
We certainly do. And that's all we can do. I mean, Gandhi said we must be the change that we want to see in the world. Yeah. And that's an injunction for each individual.
Well, John, thank you very much for coming
Bruce.
on the show.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it very much. And thanks for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.